If you have any interest in classic rock, you might have heard the name Frank Zappa spoken in hushed whispers, or referenced randomly in places you'd least expect it. Then, you'd go to check him out and see that there are over 100 albums released under his name. Navigating through Zappa's discography can be overwhelming, but if you're willing to sift through some of the filler, there's a lot to love. If you're interested in Zappa's music, but don't know where to start, you've come to the right place. This video is going to do two things. First, I'm going to sort Frank Zappa's discography into different eras/styles. Zappa's sound often varies, but not so much that it is completely uncategorizable. Tracking his releases over the years makes it simple enough to understand how his sonic interests developed over time. Then, I'm going to give my suggested listening order for newcomers, as I feel listening to only one era or just one era at a time won't necessarily give you the best and most complete impression of Zappa's catalog. This suggested listening order will largely stick to the albums Zappa released while he was alive, in part because I have not listened to all of the posthumous releases, and also because many of the posthumous albums, while valuable in terms of showcasing all of the different bands Zappa played with over the years, tend to be structured differently than the albums Zappa himself released, often acting as full concert releases or grab bags of outtakes rather than proper sit-down album experiences. I say largely because I will include two posthumous albums in the recommended listening order, Civilization Phase 3 and Leather. The former was the project Zappa worked on closest to his death and is thus often considered canon by fans as a sort of swan song to his career. The latter is a compilation/alternate presentation of 4 albums Zappa released during his lifetime, the details of which I'll get into later, and is once again considered by many to be the definitive way of listening to those tracks. Leather will thus replace Studio 10, Zappa in New York, Orchestral Favorites, and Sleep Dirt in the listening order. It is worth noting that there are a few more posthumous albums that Zappa worked on directly in some fashion that I will not be including in the listening order because he shelved them before his death and seemingly did not intend to release them in the same manner as Civilization Phase 3. Along with Civilization Phase 3, Mystery Disc, Imaginary Diseases, Transfusion, Wazoo, One Shot Deal, Feeding the Monkeys at Mimicin, Finer Moments, and Dance Me This are the posthumous releases thus far that Zappa compiled and produced himself. A token of his extreme, the Dubroom Special, and Cheaper Than Cheap are the soundtracks to concert films that Zappa also oversaw. Finally, Everything Is Healing Nicely, Quadriophiliac, Little Dots, Funky Nothingness, and Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go 1968 are posthumous releases that were not compiled for release by Zappa himself, but do contain tracks he at least worked on to some degree. These albums occupy something of an odd middle ground between the albums he prepared for release himself and the ones his family put out after his death. This isn't in the script, but I realized as I was reading that it's probably important that I go over 2 vocabulary terms. The first is the Mothers. The Mothers, or the Mothers of Invention, it was Zappa's band up until the mid-70s when he started labeling everything as a solo release. And conceptual continuity are basically references or like in-jokes to other songs within the material. And they come up a good amount during the listening order, so I thought I should probably mention them here. The Psych era is Zappa's first chronologically, running from the beginning of his recorded career up until We're Only In It For The Money. Sonically, it's pretty distinct from anything else he would do later in his career, and even later with this lineup, which is why I've chosen to cut this era off at We're Only In It For The Money, despite it not being the final album of the Mother's original run. This era features, in my opinion, Zappa's strongest lyrical work. As though he is still as unsubtle as he is later in his career, the satire feels a lot less tongue-in-cheek and more directly scathing. There's a real sense of dread on Brown Shoes Don't Make It and all of We're Only In It For The Money that you don't really get with Zappa's more overtly comedic work. Another feature of this era that marks it as something of an outlier in Zappa's overall discography is the lack of complete live releases, something that remained a problem until the Whiskey concert was finally released last year. Zappa did release ahead of their time during his lifetime, but that release is kind of an outlier for reasons we'll get to later. There was also a road tapes release of the Mother's original lineup, but that series of albums does not have the best recording quality, so for the sake of argument, we're also going to say that that one's kind of an exception. The orchestral style is the first of a handful of styles that Zappa would visit throughout his career rather than just for the lifespan of a particular lineup. Additionally, unlike with other styles, Zappa would sometimes release albums that were half orchestral and half whatever else he happened to be working on at the time. Namely 200 Motels, The Perfect Stranger, and Civilization Phase 3. Zappa had, in some interviews, mentioned that it was actually orchestral music, not rock music, that was his true passion. But did that mean orchestral music was his best work? Zappa's orchestral work is a mixed bag to me. The Yellow Shark and Orchestral Favorites are enjoyable listens, and I would even go as far as to say that Lumpy Gravy is great, but London Symphony Orchestra is one of my least favorite Zappa albums, and the orchestral pieces on 200 Motels drag down a decent collection of rock songs. Generally, I tend to prefer orchestral reinterpretations of his rock songs to the pieces he wrote specifically for orchestra. There's actually only one doo-wop album, and that's Cruisin' with Reuben and the Jets, but I thought it deserved its own category anyway, since it's so different sonically from anything else Zappa ever released. Technically, there is also the posthumous Greasy Love Songs, but that's just a slightly expanded version of Reuben and the Jets with a different name. Zappa did one-off doo-wop songs on various albums throughout his career, and I think it actually worked out better that way. Since compiled all together like they are on Reuben and the Jets, they start to sound very repetitive. I'm not too upset that this style is just a one-off. The avant-prog era consists of the second half of the original Mother's Run, starting with Uncle Meat and ending with Burnt Weenie Sandwich. This era adds jazz improvisation to the Mother's original psych-tinged sound, giving it an entirely different feel. These improvisations are sort of hit and miss, and I think to some degree bloat down the albums they feature on, but I admire the ambition. The Flo and Eddie era is named for the two frontmen of this much maligned era of Zappa's career, though I personally find a lot to enjoy about it. Here's where the comedy rock stylings that Zappa is most known for emerge in earnest. This era is home to a lot of strong, straightforward rockers, as well as a few compositions that carry on the ambition from the avant-prog era, such as Billy the Mountain and the rearranged Call Any Vegetable off of the underrated Just Another Band from LA. This is the first era of Zappa to see a live release, and posthumous live releases would showcase a jazzier side to this lineup, though I am by no means the first person to point this out. Like his orchestral work, Zappa would visit jazz fusion throughout his career. Much of his 70s work could be considered jazz fusion of some variety, so to be clear, when I talk about Zappa's jazz fusion works, I'm specifically talking about the albums that are direct successors to Hot Rats, Zappa's first fusion record and one fans often cite as his best record. I'm also including the Grand Wazoo in this category, as though it is not a Hot Rats sequel technically speaking, it functions as sort of a sister album to Waka Jawaka, the second Hot Rats album. Personally, I'm not as hot on the pure jazz fusion albums as most others are, as I prefer the jazz fusion mixed in with some other stuff, but I can recognize that they stand as important landmarks during Zappa's career. The Roxy era is named for Roxy and Elsewhere, another album widely considered to be one of Zappa's strongest efforts. Furthermore, the Roxy era as a whole is generally agreed among fans to be Zappa's best, to the point that the posthumous releases are almost oversaturated with Roxy era recordings. No one Roxy album contains the same lineup as the others, but enough key personnel is carried over from album to album that this era has a fairly consistent sound. Unlike with the jazz fusion material, I would tend to agree with the consensus that the Roxy era is the best one. Not necessarily because it houses all of my favorite Zappa albums, but because it's probably the best place for newcomers to start. Inca Roads and Don't Eat the Yellow Snow are two of Zappa's most well-known songs, and this era strikes a nice balance between the jazz fusion and comedy rock styles that would come before and after, respectively. The comedy not being too overbearingly bawdy yet, and the jazz elements being technically complex while still having a certain pop sensibility to them. I'll talk more about this when I get to my recommended listening order, but TLDR, if you want to know how to get into Frank Zappa, listen to Apostrophe first and then poke around the rest of the Roxy era. The post-Roxy era is the first of two Zappa eras not to have a consistent sound, as this period from the mid to late 70s largely consists of the shift from the final Roxy lineup to the Shake Your Booty lineup, as well as a couple of one-off bands thrown in there for good measure. The crown jewel of this era was supposed to be the mythical Leather album, which as we've already spoken about was forcibly split into 4 different albums due to legal drama with the label, until it was finally released in its complete form shortly after Zappa's death. In any case, despite the inconsistencies, there's still strong material throughout this era, including Studio 10 and Zoot Allures. The posthumous stuff from this era is worth checking out too, to hear some of the different lineups. Shake Your Booty is one of Zappa's most commercially successful albums besides Apostrophe, and is the zenith of Zappa's explicit comedy music. Though compositionally the album has a couple of misses, mostly the instrumentals, Shake Your Booty is, for my money, the best produced Zappa album, having a clean, sharp arena rock sound. The Side One Suite in particular is really strong and serves as a good way of grabbing listeners to then hit them with the big singles in sides 2 and 3. Although Shake Your Booty is the only Zappa album with this particular lineup, I also like to consider Joe's Garage and You Are What You Is as part of this era, as they share similar comedic and sonic styles, and even do the same thing with the side-along suites that Shake Your Booty does. In the 80s, Zappa started releasing albums of just guitar solos edited out from various live performances, which perhaps isn't particularly surprising when you consider how crucial they are to his identity as an artist. I enjoyed these albums more than I was expecting considering their length and compositional repetitiveness, but they're still probably not essential for the non-completist all things considered. Like the post-Roxy era, the early 80s had a lot of different lineups and none of them had enough releases to be considered their own thing, so they're all being lumped together. Zappa may have claimed to hate trends, but even he wasn't immune to cheesy 80s synth voices. I almost considered including Tinseltown Rebellion and posthumous live releases from the early 80s in the Shake Your Booty era because they have the same edgy comedy and released before You Are What You Is, which is a Shake Your Booty style album, but sonically the use of synths lands Tinseltown Rebellion and its associates firmly in the early 80s category. I think this era is probably Zappa's weakest overall, as it featured a lot of throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck, and unlike the post-Roxy era, not much of it did. That's not to say nothing good released during this era, but the good is held back by the forgettable, like Does Humor Belong in Music, and the terrible, like The Man from Utopia. Halfway through the 80s, Zappa discovered the synclaver, an early MIDI instrument that allowed him to write songs that sounded like Super Nintendo songs on cocaine. I'm being facetious, but in all honesty, I can't say I particularly enjoy much of what Zappa did with the synclaver because a lot of it sounds like the less interesting of his abstract orchestral work. but with a cheap MIDI sound font slapped on top of it. What's worse, he became so enamored with the instrument that he straight up stopped playing guitar for a while. Once again, there's not nothing good here, but either there's more bad or I'm just not sophisticated enough to appreciate the technical marvel that is the synclaver. Though Zappa did quite a number of live albums throughout his career, they weren't really live albums in the traditional sense of an artist playing their greatest hits to an audience with maybe some minor rearrangements and jamming added in for good measure. Instead, Zappa performed and released pieces live that he never played in the studio, effectively making the live albums just as important as the studio releases. That being said, towards the very end of his career and lifespan, Zappa did release a series of albums that came close to the traditional image of the rock live album, and that was the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series. These albums did indeed feature a grab bag of tracks from throughout Zappa's career, largely veering away from songs that had not seen release before in some form, with a few exceptions. It sounds cool on paper, but in practice these albums are a total slog to get through, most of them being between 2 and 3 hours long, with much of that time being taken up by filler tracks and guitar solos. It's an absolute pacing nightmare, and these albums are best experienced by cherry-picking the actually stand-up performances and listening to them outside of the context of the albums they come in. But then, the point of this being a 6-album set and not one singular live album was so it could contain a little bit of everything. The set was originally based on a project called Warts and All, after all, so perhaps pruning it down would be antithetical to what Zappa intended. Then again, the author is dead and these albums are really not good as sit-down listening experiences, so I think I'll make my best of playlist anyway, linked in the description. Ironically, the second volume of this series is not a You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore album, but rather a Roxy era album, as it features performances selected from a 2-night run of concerts during the Roxy era rather than performances across Zappa's entire career. This era still has 6 albums though, as the posthumous release of One Shot Deal, despite not bearing the title of the series, is a live album compiling tracks from throughout Zappa's career, and it's hard to categorize otherwise, so it's going here. Also worth noting is that Volume 5 is an album split between 2 specific lineups, so it almost violates the spirit of this series in the same way that the second volume does, but since it is 2 different lineups and not a single lineup, I'll leave it here for simplicity's sake. Almost done now, the final main era of Frank Zappa's discography consists of albums released from recordings during his final tour in 1988. There were 3 of these albums plus the posthumous release, easily constituting an era of its own. As will soon become apparent, it's clear this band had quite a bit of range, again not my original observation, and after losing much of his satirical edge following the initial Psych era, Zappa finally returns here with some biting satire. Last and definitely least, there are a couple of straight-up compilation albums that are nonetheless considered to be canonical numbered releases. I don't really have much to say about these. Most of them aren't very interesting, and Mother Mania was the only one Zappa released himself. Some alternate mixes of songs can be found on these compilations, but I don't really think those make these compilations worth your time as complete packages. Now that all the albums have been categorized, we can finally get into my recommended listening order for beginners. I'll also be giving my opinion on each album, but whether or not I personally enjoy any given album shouldn't stop you from checking it out. I really do suggest listening to Zappa's entire discography in order to get a complete understanding of the music. As a bonus, I highly recommend listening to an album a day or every couple days until you're done with everything. This is what I did for the majority of his discography, and apart from meaning you'll actually get through all of it at a decent pace, it will also help to both immerse you in the music and just generally makes for a more memorable experience. Apostrophe is an easy recommendation for your first Zappa album. It's a Roxy era release, meaning that it features arguably his best band and has a solid mix of both comedy and jazz rock, so it's a good barometer for if you'll like Zappa's other work. What makes this album a better candidate as a starting point than his other albums is that it opens with Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, which is one of Zappa's most commercially successful and therefore accessible songs. Apostrophe is also pretty good, but not Zappa's best album, which I think is important, because you don't want everything to be downhill from the very beginning. One Size Fits All goes a little further off the prog rock deep end, but it also has Inca Roads as its opener, which is essential listening for anyone even remotely interested in Zappa. It's another Roxy era album, and normally I won't try to lump too many albums of the same era together, but I'm going to make an exception for the Roxy era because, again, it's his most accessible work. That being said, we are going to take a bit of a break from the Roxy era to listen to Hot Rats. I'm not as high on this album as most people are. I actually think it kind of falls off after side 1, but I fully acknowledge I'm in the minority on that one. Plus, like with listening to the previous 2 albums, the opening track Peaches and Regalia is mandatory listening, so you have to get this album out of the way early for that track alone. In any case, you'll probably like this album more than I did if you're like most people out there. Hot Rats is the one Zappa album that even non-fans tend to enjoy. Shake Your Booty is another one of Zappa's more pop-oriented albums and thus makes for good early listening. This one was my favorite Zappa album for a while, though I've since come to find other albums are more consistent. Still, like I mentioned when discussing the overall Shake Your Booty style, this album has a phenomenal opening side and overall sounds great. Next, I'll suggest Freak Out, because I think it's good to get some early Mothers in there, and being his debut, Freak Out is easily the most accessible of his 60s work. Zappa quickly abandons the psych sound after the first lineup of the Mothers disbands, so we're not going to listen to much else from this era for a while, but it helps just to get your ears wet. Overnight Sensation is the third out of 4 Roxy era albums we've listened to so far, though we're going to save the fourth one for a little bit later. This album actually didn't click with me until just a couple weeks ago, but now I love it. Montana is another song that Zappa would play live a lot throughout his career, and in general this album has a lot of setlist mainstays on it. Joe's Garage, being a rock opera, is a lot lengthier than all the albums we've checked out so far, but being of the Shake Your Booty style, it's still fairly accessible. Get past the juvenile humor and there's a lot of spicy soloing and musical complexity on this album. Watermelon and Easter Hay is often highlighted as Zappa's best guitar solo, but the solos on Packard Goose and Keep It Greasy do a good job highlighting the crunching rhythm section that always holds down the fort during Zappa's lengthy solos. Despite being a rock opera, the story isn't too much to write home about, but at least it helps to give the album a sense of cohesion. 7 albums in and we're pretty much done with what I would consider the accessible material. That's not to say everything from here on is super dense jazz and chamber music, but now would be a good time to check in with yourself because if you hate everything you've heard so far, what's left probably won't change your mind. That being said, we're now going to have a taste of Zappa's orchestral work with Lumpy Gravy. It's not a fully orchestral album, as there are also elements of sound collage and psych on here, but it's an overall fun listen with a lot of references to Zappa's other work. Zappa would play Oh No a good amount over the years, but the instrumental rendition on here is by far my favorite. Something about the texture of the piano, marimba, I can't really tell, lends the melody an ethereal air. This album was a personal favorite of Zappa's and it definitely stands out to me among all of his orchestral works. Continuing to venture into different eras, we have Zoodalores, our first post-Roxy album. Wikipedia defines it as a heavy metal album, and while I'm not sure I agree with that, it definitely has a heavier guitar and bass sound production-wise, which I'm honestly not a fan of, but the compositions themselves make up for it. A lot of the songs follow a pop structure, so it's still decently entry-level, though it's got some longer, jammier songs that ended up becoming concert staples, like The Torture Never Stops and Black Napkins. The final Roxy-era album we have to listen to, and the one the band is named for, Roxy and Elsewhere, is one of Zappa's tightest live releases in terms of consistency and pacing, making it probably the best live album to start with. I chose to space it out from the other Roxy albums because it leans a little more into the complex fusion side of things, especially on Don't You Ever Watch That Thing and Bebop Tango, but the energy of the performances themselves still keep the material digestible. Running with Roxy and Elsewhere's jazz inclinations into full fusion territory, Waka Jawaka is the sequel to Hot Rats and in my opinion is a more consistent listen overall. Now for another representative of a different 70s Zappa era, we have Fillmore East, June 1971. Zappa's first live release. The whole album has this fun rock energy to it, with a mini rock opera running through most of side 1 and the first half of side 2. This album tends to garner mixed opinions, but I personally think it's one of Zappa's more underrated albums. Back to Basics, Absolutely Free is the sequel to Freak Out and follows much of the same ethos, though with increasingly pointed satirical direction. The fact that both sides are sweets further strengthens the album's conceptual cohesion, and the 1-2 punch closer of Brown Shoes Don't Make It, one of the few songs to genuinely instill fear in me, and America Drinks and Goes Home, a sleazy jazz number that ends in a bar fight, leaves such a strong impression. It might be my favorite Zappa album if it weren't for We're Only in It for the Money. Viscerally satirical, the album paints a dire picture of America as a declining culture. The material here is a mix of truly harrowing and memorable pop tunes. I can't recommend this album enough. Mother Mania is a compilation album, but it features a couple of different mixes done by Zappa himself, so it counts. To be fair, the songs on here from We're Only in It for the Money are uncensored and have the lumpy gravy bits removed, so those new mixes are actually worth listening to, but the rest are kind of whatever. Right after the final Psych album makes the most sense to me placement-wise. Uncle Meat is still the original Mother's lineup, but as the first avant-prog era album, it's sonically completely different. Uncle Meat reminds me of the Beatles' White Album in a lot of ways, both being stylistically eclectic double albums that feel gargantuan in vision. This should be Zappa's masterpiece, but something about it has never really clicked with me. I think side 3 just gets a little lost in all the improvisation. Just Another Band from LA is easily the best Flo and Eddie album released during Zappa's lifetime. The sidelong Billy the Mountain is probably my favorite Zappa piece, less of a singular song and more so a mix of sketch comedy and little musical snippets, chock full of cultural references and set up for later bits of conceptual continuity. The B-side has exhilarating new arrangements of Colony, Vegetable, and Dog Breath too, which we had to listen to Absolutely Free and Uncle Meat first to fully appreciate. The Grand Wazoo is next to give us a break from all of the heavy rock stuff. As mentioned earlier, it was released around the same time as Waka Jawaka. After the original Mothers broke up, what was and wasn't labeled as a Mothers album seemed to be basically random. I don't like this album as much as Waka Jawaka, though I haven't listened to it since my original listen, so take that opinion with a grain of salt. Back now to the Flo and Eddie era, 200 Motels is half rock and half orchestral. The rock stuff ranges from mediocre to great and features fun callbacks to the other two Flo and Eddie albums we've listened to thus far. The orchestral stuff, on the other hand, is pretty much all boring, with the exception of maybe Dental Hygiene Dilemma, if only for the dialogue spoken over it. I always wondered why Jeff Simmons returned for the Roxy era after Zappa released that song, but I digress. Rounding out the original Mothers lineup as well as the avant-prog era as a whole, we have Burnt Weenie Sandwich and Weasels Rip My Flesh. These are actually pretty different sounding albums, with the former being tightly composed and the latter improv heavy. Like with Uncle Meat, I've always admittedly found the improv pieces on Weasels Rip My Flesh kind of hard to get into, although the title track is pretty funny. But the actual songs on this album, namely My Guitar Wants to Kill Your Mama and the returning Oh No, now with lyrics, are Zappa classics. Then of course, Burnt Weenie Sandwich has The Little House I Used to Live In, an epic suite that live renditions never quite do justice. The doo-wop tracks are good too. Leather, as mentioned before, is Zappa's so-called lost masterpiece, and consists of Studio Tan, orchestral favorites Sleep Dirt, and Zappa in New York. The Studio Tan material is my favorite from this collection, shout out to Gregory Peccary, though each album has its highlights. I especially want to give a shout out to the orchestral favorites version of Strictly Gentile, which really brings the song to life. Admittedly, I do find the 3-hour length of this collection a bit daunting and would usually rather listen to Studio Tan, but I know that's a hot take among Zappa fans, and I definitely want to give the full package another shot at some point. Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch is our first 80s album, and I've decided to save the 80s stuff until a bit later in the list because honestly I find Zappa's 80s material to be generally weaker than his 60s and 70s stuff. It doesn't even have anything to do with the sound, I just think the songwriting on these albums is less consistent, with one exception that we'll get to later. That being said, Ship Arriving Too Late does have Valley Girl on it, which was Zappa's biggest hit while he was alive, so that makes this album one of the more accessible 80s releases. The rest of this album isn't quite as memorable, although I do like No Not Now, despite how dumb the lyrics are. Despite being billed as a collaboration with Captain Beefheart, Bongo Fury is mostly just another Zappa live album, as Beefheart's songwriting contributions are disappointingly limited to just 2 songs. Muffin Man is a Zappa classic, and Carolina Hardcore Ecstasy is a hidden gem, but otherwise I find this album largely forgettable. Advanced Romance is good too, but there are better versions of it on other albums. Featuring Terry Bozzio on drums and Missing Ruth Underwood on percussion, this is the first post-Roxy album chronologically, and for the last album to carry the mother's name, it sure is an odd one. Chunger's Revenge is another oddball album. Though timeline-wise it's a Flo and Eddie album, instead of being straight comedy rock, it's got a few jazz compositions on it and 1 or 2 leftovers from the Psych era that weren't recorded at the time. It's got a few good songs on it, although similar to Bongo Fury, as a complete package it has a little too much filler for my liking. You Are What You Is, for my money, is probably the best thing Zappa released in the 80s. Spiritually a sequel to Shake Your Booty, instead of having one side-long suite, every one of its 4 sides is a suite. Most of the songs are really catchy, and side 1 in particular is excellent. If I did have one complaint about this album, I would say that some of the lyrics are kind of inane, but then some of them are really strong, like on Society Pages. I appreciate this album more every time I listen to it. The first 2 tracks of Tinseltown Rebellion are essential Zappa, but the rest of it kind of falls flat for me. There's a live rendition of Brown Shoes Don't Make It at the end that should be better than it is, and a couple of weird stage pieces that don't translate super well to an album format. Because I left so much of the 80s stuff until the end, I made sure to hold back at least a few of the earlier albums to listen to in between so we don't get fatigued. The first of these albums is the last remaining original Mothers album, Cruisin' with Ruben and the Jets. A doo-wop album, Ruben and the Jets is a mix of new songs and rearranged songs from Freak Out. Somewhat ironically, none of the returning songs were doo-wop songs originally. Those early albums had doo-wop songs, but Zappa specifically chose songs that weren't doo-wop and made them doo-wop. Some of these rearrangements would become the way these songs were played live throughout the 70s and 80s. Interestingly, this album also features 2 songs written by Ray Collins without the assistance of Zappa. Sort of surprising considering how Collins didn't get a writing credit for the lyrics on Duke of Prunes, but I digress. I gave most of my thoughts on this album during its era section, so let's move on to Jazz from Hell, our first album in the listening order to primarily feature the Synclaver. For what it's worth, if there's one Synclaver album to listen to, it's probably this one, since Francesco Zappa is a covers album and The Perfect Stranger is half orchestral. But of course, that doesn't matter because we're listening to all the albums. I think the Synclaver stuff is mostly either love it or hate it, and I'm definitely closer to the hated end of the spectrum. My dad once compared music I made as a preteen and Muse scored to Jazz from Hell, so take that as you will. At least the closing track on this album is pretty good, although even then I'm mostly just saying that because I like the orchestral version on The Yellow Shark. Baby Snakes is the soundtrack to a Shake Your Booty era concert film, and the best way I can describe it is that it features A-tier performances of B-tier material. As a result, this album lands in something of an odd spot. I would say it's still overall an enjoyable listen, although the posthumous Hammersmith Odeon makes this album kind of irrelevant. Francesco Zappa is another Synclaver album, and it's fine. All the tracks are renditions of pieces by this obscure classical composer, and so it's a very atypical Zappa album. Like I said though, as a listening experience, it's pleasant enough. The style of composition in combination with the Synclaver's unique sonic intonation gives the album a very distinctly RPG Maker XP sound. Once again, I'm being facetious, but I don't hate this album, it's just kind of whatever. You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 2, on the other hand, is very much not just whatever. The first You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore album we're listening to, though for all intents and purposes, this is really a Roxy era album. Although it's the shortest You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore album, at around 2 hours, it still runs a little long for my liking. Still, there are plenty of solid renditions of notorious Roxy era tracks on here, plus a couple of cool extras, like a 70s Idiot Bastard Son and a fucked up version of Montana where they riff on the title of the Allman Brothers Whipping Post. Them or Us, as a double album, definitely has a sort of grab bag quality to it, but the distinction is that the pieces grabbed from the bag are all pretty good. There are a lot of experimental comedy tracks on here, mixed in with some absolutely crunching guitar solos. Plus, Be In My Video is just a really solid pop rock song. And hey, they actually learned Whipping Post. Conceptual continuity is funny sometimes. Sure, it's kind of a limp cover that turns the gnarly guitar solo into this reggae thing, but hey, it's there. The Perfect Stranger is the last of the Synclaver albums that we have to listen to, excepting a few appearances of the instrument on Thingfish and in Civilization Phase 3. That being said, half of it is orchestral, as previously stated. The orchestral material is probably the stronger stuff on here, although the Synclaver version of Girl in the Magnesium Dress is decent too. Not much else to say here. Like Francesco Zappa, it's just fine. Does Humor Belong in Music is probably Zappa's least notable release. He has a few other albums that are just fine, as we've mentioned, but unlike those albums, there's no gimmick or weird quirk with this one. It's just another live album. The name would seem to indicate that the selections are mostly comedy rock, but no, not really. There's nothing really noteworthy about the performances either, it's just kind of there. If there were a skippable album on this listening list, it would be this one. But, of course, we're not skipping any albums. Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention would be a similarly nothing release if it weren't for its closing track, Porn Wars, which, contrary to the name, is not a comedy rock track, but instead a sound collage, which sounds completely different from anything else Zappa has made ever. Additionally, the opening track, I Don't Even Care, was recently revealed to be based on a jam from the Roxy era with the release of the Cheaper Than Cheap soundtrack, which I just think is pretty cool. Let's just get this one out of the way. The Man from Utopia is terrible. It lures you into a false sense of security with a decent opener, Cocaine Decisions, and then promptly launches into a deluge of garbage. There's a trio of experimental gimmick tracks on here, and I see what Zappa was going for with them, but they're just not very enjoyable to listen to. The rest of the album is bad comedy rock. We had to listen to it, but thankfully now it's done. I don't hate Thingfish as much as other people do, and that's all I'm willing to say on it because I fear being associated with this album. London Symphony Orchestra is the second Zappa album I really don't like. Most of the pieces on here feel directionless, causing the often 10-minute tracks to feel never-ending. The nicest thing I can say about this album is that I like the percussion sound. It also ends with a competent arrangement of Strictly Gentile, though still not as good as the version on Orchestral Favorites. Though we've been trying to separate albums of the same era up until this point, now that we're nearing the end of Zappa's discography, I think it makes sense to focus on the albums he released towards the end of his career, as a lot of those albums have a certain retrospective quality to them anyways. The remaining albums in question are the guitar solo albums, the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series, the 88 tour albums, a couple of archival albums, and a couple of orchestral albums. We'll be tackling the guitar solo albums first. There are two of them, but they're basically the same album. Both the Shut Up and Play Your Guitar box set and Guitar do a surprisingly good job keeping a tight pace despite being pretty long. I probably won't ever listen to them again, but they're not as much of a drag as some of Zappa's other retrospective career compilations. Playground Psychotics is the third and final Zappa album that I would say I strongly dislike, which is a shame because it's also the last album from the underrated Flo and Eddie era on this list. The actual musical content is alright enough. Playground Psychotics would probably be an average Zappa live release if it weren't for the inclusion of copious amounts of band chatter and comedy sketches that come off as more uncomfortable than funny. I see the vision, I just don't think it pays off like Zappa wanted it to. You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 1 opens with a similar bit of band chatter, although thankfully that's where it ends. What I said about the series during its era section applies to all of these albums, so instead of repeating myself, I'll just talk about the highlights. And for this album, that's the 20-minute rendition of Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, complete with possibly the most bizarre audience participation segment in Zappa's discography, which is saying a lot. Broadway the Hard Way is the first 88 tour album we're listening to, and I find this album to be vastly underrated. Sure, there is some filler, but at its strongest, this album has Zappa's best satirical writing since the Psych era. Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk and Dickie's Such an Asshole are absolutely scathing and justify this album's existence all on its own. Everything else is just a bonus. You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 3 has fun renditions of some Shake Your Booty era songs, the original Roxy era version of Dickie's Such an Asshole, and a version of King Kong that stitches together several live performances of the piece, although the effect is hindered somewhat by the fact that most of the source recordings chosen use the same 80s reggae arrangement. It does have an awesome callback to the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 1 version of Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, which is insane because no one in the audience would have gotten that reference. It only works in the context of listening back to these recordings after the fact. Incidentally, King Kong also appears on Ahead of Their Time, the only fully live release of the original Mothers during Zappa's lifetime. Zappa himself described that album as an average performance rather than anything exemplary. Side note, why would you release something that by your own standards is just okay? And also appended a comedy show to the start of the album. Those two factors combined make it feel a bit disingenuous to me as a live release, like it's not wholly representative of that lineup's lifestyle. That issue isn't resolved by You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 5, which does use its first disc to focus on the original Mothers, but once again, many of those tracks are comedy tracks. The album does open with a previously unheard original Mothers composition though, so that's something. The 80s set on the second disc is probably more consistent than the set on the first disc, but it doesn't have much in the way of standout tracks, so in the end, this is a very inconsistent release. Mega Jazz Noise Here is probably my least favorite of the 88 tour releases, though it's still not terrible or anything. It has some fun moments on it, but for the most part I just find it has the same pacing issues as the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series. If you like the Jazz Fusion albums more than I did, you'll probably like this one more than I did too. You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 4 actually has a lot of really cool cuts on it. The new renditions of all the songs in the medley from tracks 3 to 6 are really good. Take Me Out to the Ballgame is a fascinating excerpt from A Pound for a Brown jam, and the dueling guitar solos on Stevie's Spanking make the Them or Us version sound incomplete by comparison. This is probably my favorite album from this collection, if I had to choose one. The best band you never heard in your life is the final 88 tour album we have to listen to, and this is another strong release. Mixing strong rearrangements of 70s deep cuts with unique cover selections. Not too much to say here, just a really solid live album. You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore Volume 6 this is the last album in the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series, and it's the one I have the least to say about. There's some cool Flo and Eddie material on here, I guess. Honestly, this release feels even more scattered than the rest of this very scattered series. Civilization Phase 3. It's like if the sprawling nature of Uncle Meat met the sonic flavorings of Lumpy Gravy and Jazz from Hell. A lot of people consider it one of Zappa's masterpieces. I don't like it. Like a lot of the albums Zappa released towards the end of his life, it's way too long and abstract. I'm sure it's an album I could learn to appreciate, but there isn't much about it that makes me want to give it another listen. Once again though, I'm in the minority, so listen to it and form your own thoughts. It's definitely the most unnecessary of the posthumous releases in terms of artistic intention. I think The Yellow Shark is a much better candidate for Zappa's swan song. The final album the man released in his lifetime, The Yellow Shark's contents strike a nice balance between arrangements of pieces released throughout Zappa's career and new compositions. The album has a certain feeling of grandiosity and importance. Hearing several pieces from Uncle Meat presented in this style make for something of a full circle moment. It's not even one of my favorite Zappa albums, but it works so well as a conclusion. And with that, we've reached the end of Frank Zappa's living discography. Before I give my final thoughts, I want to highlight a couple of posthumous releases that I personally enjoy. If you like Shake Your Booty as much as I do, the aforementioned Hammersmith Odeon is a great portrait of that era's band live. Carnegie Hall does something similar for the Flo and Eddie era, and features a killer Billy the Mountain. I like Funky Nothingness more than a lot of the Jazz Fusion albums Zappa released himself, and the last two tracks on that album are mandatory listening. Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go 1968 finally shows us what the original Mothers sounded like live. Spoiler alert, they sound great. Philly 76 is Zappa's only album with a female vocalist, Lady Bianca, adding some cool textural differences to the music. And last but not least, all the Roxy-era film soundtracks, there is a shocking number of them, are great. For this last bit, I'll have the complete listening order up on screen for easy access. I've been wanting to make a Zappa discography ranking for years, but I struggled with how to format it because I had more to say about some albums than others. This listening order style turned out to be the perfect way to get my thoughts out succinctly, and also lets me make a Zappa flowchart, another thing I've been wanting to make for a while. If nothing else, I hope this video convinces some of you to give Frank Zappa's music a try. I know at the end of last year I teased a Fear and Hunger review, and I'm sorry I never got around to that. I hit a spot of writer's block and I decided I just wanted to make something easy. I might still make that review eventually, I might not, but either way, I hope you guys stick around for whatever weird thing I make next. Speaking of which, I released an EP recently, and you should check that out. I've been told that at least one song I've written sounds like Frank Zappa, so if you like that stuff, then hey, you might like my stuff. Alright, shilling over. Until then.